So the main reason I was able to see Boo! A Madea Halloween was because only one movie came out last weekend, and that was Inferno, because Rings, I believe, must have got pushed back. Now on one hand, I'm glad that Rings didn't come out because it looked pretty bad, and so thankfully I get to wait till possibly next year before it comes out. I think it got pushed back to either January or February of next year, somewhere along those lines. But at the same time, I'm also kind of sad that Rings didn't come out because since Inferno was the only movie last weekend, we had to fill the void with something else, and that's why we saw Boo! A Madea Halloween. I probably would have rather seen Rings over that. So, Inferno completes the trilogy, if you want to even call it a trilogy. I mean, it is a series of movie adaptations from Dan Brown novels, but it's not really a trilogy. They're all sort of their own thing, kind of like how James Bond movies are their own thing, or apparently the Jack Reacher movies too. But anyway, Inferno is the sequel to Angels and Demons and the Da Vinci Code, and brings Robert Langdon back on the big screen as Tom Hanks. Or should I say, played by Tom Hanks. And again, this professor is thrown into a big mess. Apparently, this big billionaire biochemist has created a plague ready to spread across the world. The plague is named Inferno, and he has left a bunch of clues in order for his predecessors to find it in case he should die. Unfortunately for Robert Langdon, he wakes up in a hospital with amnesia. A bullet has grazed his head. He doesn't know how he got there, what is happening, what happened to him. And so him and a doctor played by Felicity Jones are thrown into this mess and now have to find the clues and find Inferno before any of these other people racing to get Inferno find it and possibly either sell it off the black market or use it to start the plague. And while this is all going on, Robert Langdon is trying to find out what happened, how he got here, try to piece together the clues and the memories in his mind, as he's also having hallucinations. Now I have to admit, I did enjoy this movie, mainly because I did really like the Da Vinci Code and Angels and Demons. And I will warn you, if you didn't like either of those two movies, or you liked them and you want to see something very different, well, you might not get enough different in Inferno, because it is pretty much very similar to the other two movies. In fact, it pretty much has a similar twist that the other two films also had, to the point where I should have guessed it, and I should have realized the twist because it's the same as the other two films. But if you want to see more of Robert Langdon played by Tom Hanks, figuring out these clues, going around the world to different ancient cities, well, you're in luck, because that's what Inferno is. Now, while there is a lot of copy and paste plot-wise in this movie from the others, there is a few different things that I appreciated in Inferno. For one, this actually makes sense as an October release, because the hallucinations he has of hell and these visions are quite horrific. I knew there was going to be hallucinations. I've never read the book, but I knew there was going to be hallucinations from the trailer, but I honestly didn't expect them to be as horrific as they are. Mind you, it's still PG-13, and it's really not too horrific if you've seen a lot of horror movies, but it's more horrific than I would have imagined Inferno to actually be. There's some pretty creepy and grotesque things in his visions. Sometimes they could look a little cartoony, but they're still grotesque nonetheless. And if you don't like movies like the Da Vinci Code and National Treasure, where you think that, oh, it's so implausible that there's clues on these historical things and artistic ancient things, well, in this one it is a little bit more plausible, because it is someone else that has put these clues together, not someone of ancient times, but of someone of modern times, someone who has created a virus and has left a path for his followers in order to get to it in case he dies, which he does die. In fact, the first scene is him dying, the bad guy. So I will say it is a little less far-fetched than movies of its type, but it's still going to be far-fetched for many people, I'm sure. I will say this, I like the acting, I like the characters, nothing groundbreaking, nothing like, oh, these are such great actors that are going to have a really great performance, but this is not the type of film that you go into it looking for great performances. This is the kind of film that's a non-stop thriller that has action and you're like, okay, I'm on the edge of my seat the entire time. For the most part, Inferno is like that. It's a non-stop action thriller to the point where it's probably more non-stop and more of a breakneck speed than any of the other two films before it. So I did appreciate it because despite it being about 2 hours and a little over 2 hours long, this was the film that day that didn't feel like 2 hours long. This movie felt like the hour and 43 minutes that Medea should have felt like. Is it by the numbers and very predictable? Yes, it is, of course. And there are plenty of things in the trailer that give away a little too much for my taste, but that's the trailer's fault, that's not the movie's fault. Unlike the other two films, it isn't simplified as good guys and bad guys and just two teams and two groups of people. In this one, there's separate divisions and there's a multitude of people with their own intentions all going for Inferno. And so it could get a little messy, it could get a little too complex and a little too convoluted, but at the same time, I didn't feel like that. I didn't feel like I was losing it. It felt pretty straightforward to me. The dialogue isn't the greatest either. There are some times where I did roll my eyes at the things they were saying. But for the most part, it didn't really bother me and it was a little bit more forgivable. Despite the main characters being played by Tom Hanks and Felicity Jones, which both did a good job in this movie, I was actually a little bit more drawn to the side characters. Maybe it's just me liking Ben Foster and liking a lot of the roles he's played, but I was drawn to Ben Foster and his evil, villainous character, who doesn't actually seem all that villainous. He's one of those villains where you can get behind and you can understand where he's coming from. He's trying to stop us from going extinct because of overpopulation, but his methods of doing so is a little too extreme and terrorist-esque. He's one of those villains, and I liked him, and he's not in it that much. He's only in flashbacks because the first scene he's in, he dies. I'm going to just tell you off, it's the first scene, and you see it in the trailer as well. He dies. And so most of the scenes that Ben Foster's in is either through flashbacks, through little videos, through news articles and stuff like that. And I was also drawn to another character that seemed like he was going to be a villain as well. Seemed like he was this head of this private security sort of espionage sort of stuff. I'm just going to put the actor's name down below in case I mispronounce it. But he was actually really good in the film, and at least I was interested in his character. I thought his character, when he actually does action towards the end of the film, he was pretty damn badass. The main movies I remember him from is he was in Jurassic World and he was the park owner, and he was also in Life of Pi as the adult version of Pi. And I was actually drawn to his character and Ben Foster's character more than anything else, surprisingly. What I also appreciated in this movie is it gets right into the action right away. It's one of those fast-paced thrillers that feels like it doesn't really have a first act. Instead, it has a little sort of prologue, and then suddenly it jumps right into the second act. Yeah, the other two films, they had a first act where, okay, someone comes to Professor Langdon, asks for advice, asks for his help, he comes along, and he gets thrown into this mystery. All that is sort of taken out of the movie. Instead, there's a little prologue of the villain's death, and then it jumps right into Robert Langdon having amnesia, being in a hospital. You don't know who hired him, what he's done before in the days before he woke up from in this hospital, and suddenly someone's coming after him and shooting at him. And so in a way, the backstory of this film, the pieces that he's trying to put together in his mind, is the first act of the film, and so it feels like it skips the first act and that becomes a little bit more of the backstory and actually helps progress the movie as he figures out who he can trust and who he can't trust. Because honestly, there's a lot of players in this movie instead of just being an assassin and the good guys and then the higher up guy. It feels like there's a lot more hands involved in this movie. But despite it being a fast-paced thriller, despite it cutting off the first act, and despite a lot of things in it that I honestly admired, it didn't feel like it picked up until the final act of the film. When the final act of the film happened, that's when I thought, okay, this is actually really, really good. Or at least I felt it was just as fun as the other two films. I found the other two films fun, really good. Good watch. This one I felt was a little slower throughout the movie, despite it being much faster than the other two movies. Or at least I wasn't as excited throughout the movie until it got to the final act. There was another thriller this year like that. Jack Reacher was another film that eventually I'll review, that I felt the third act of the film far superior to the rest of the film. Inferno felt the same way, where it felt like the final act was so much more superior to the rest of the film. There was one thing about the film that felt really forced and out of place, and that is this romance that happens, or this possible romance that happens with Robert Langdon and another character, and it's not really developed in this movie. And no, it's not him and Felicity Jones's character, it's another woman completely that you barely get anything from until the final act of the film. Yeah, just before it gets to the final act is when Robert Langdon and her come into contact again, and clearly there was a past with them. Clearly they definitely loved each other long ago. But it's a sort of backstory that's added into the movie just completely out of nowhere, to the point where it's really forced. And so they're trying to have this sort of connection between the characters, but it just feels like, okay, why didn't you set up any of that beforehand? Oh, right, because the first act of the movie was cut out completely. So on one hand, I like that the first act wasn't in it because it makes it different from the other two films, but at the same time, it really cuts out that part where you're clearly supposed to be invested in these two characters bonding and having some past relationship, but you don't really get any sense of that past relationship, and so it feels forced. I also feel that that prologue part, that part that we see in the trailer where Ben Foster falls to his death, I feel that it really shouldn't have started with that scene. I really don't know how the book started, because I've never read the book, but I really feel that it should have started right in the hospital scene, not the introduction where Ben Foster is talking about his plans, not the prologue scene after that where he's running and he falls to his death. It should have started right with Robert Langdon waking up, especially since this is more of a psychological thriller because of these hallucinations he's having, because he's trying to piece together what's in his mind. It feels like it should have stuck really close to the main character and really should have started with the hospital scene. That way we see it through his eyes a little bit more and piece together the moments as he's piecing them together. Because there are moments in this movie where they could have easily placed those other two scenes I talked about. But the opening credits of the film is Ben Foster giving a speech about overpopulation and his plans to deal with it and all that. But it's really fragmented and you don't get all of it. And there's a moment in the movie later when they're looking up Ben Foster's character because of the speech that he had. It gives the full speech and the full scene. So really, they could have cut out that moment at the beginning of the film and have it be in that part of the movie when Robert Langdon finds out, so we're closer in his head and closer to piecing it together along with him. And the same goes for the prologue scene where Ben Foster's getting chased and he eventually falls off the building, which we see in the trailer. That scene could have been played out in this train ride when he talks to the person that chased Ben Foster. That could have been edited and fit right into that scene. Maybe it's just me being nitpicky, but I feel like it should have just started right at the hospital scene and those other two scenes should have been placed somewhere else. I definitely enjoyed Inferno, but I can understand people not liking it, especially if you don't like the other two films, because it is very similar to them. But there's enough uniqueness to it that I did appreciate, but at the same time, I didn't like it as much as the other two films, so I'm going to give Inferno 3.5 stars. Maybe that's pushing it a little bit, but I felt like it could have been a really good movie if tweaked a little bit, and I could have liked it as much as the other two films. So did you see Inferno? What did you think about it? Go ahead and comment below. If not, did you see Angels and Demons and Da Vinci Code? If so, which one do you like better? If you like this video and you want to see more, please subscribe and check out my movie reviews of 2015 and 2016. As always, this is Bruce Gifford, and this was Just My Opinion.